Boston, Massachusetts, February 12, 2022. Winter in Boston, Massachusetts was relentless in February 2022. The biting wind seemed to heighten the feeling of isolation on the city's quiet, snow-covered streets. The trees were bare and the old buildings covered in a layer of ice created a dark and silent scene. The cold seemed to penetrate the residents to their core, adding a layer of loneliness to the already melancholic environment. At the heart of this inhospitable setting was Beacon Hill High School, a traditional and respected institution in the community. Its corridors, usually vibrant with the sound of students' conversations and laughter, were now enveloped in a darker atmosphere, marked by the time of year and the challenges posed by the harsh winter. Alice Harper, a 33-year-old literature professor, was a warm, steady presence in an environment that felt increasingly cold. With her brown hair, always tied in an undone bun, and her green eyes that sparkled with a passion for literature, Alice was admired by her students and colleagues. She had a special way of making books come to life, using her infectious enthusiasm to capture her students' imaginations. Jake Donovan, an 18-year-old, was one of Alice's many students. With his typical teenage appearance, shaggy brown hair, and an often distant gaze, Jake was known for being a reserved but well-intentioned student. He was the type of student who stood out for his intelligence, but who rarely got involved in extracurricular activities or interacted much with his classmates. What few knew was that Jake had a silent and growing admiration for Alice, which would soon turn into a disturbing obsession. The beginning of Jake's obsession was not evident to most. He started with discreet gestures, like sending emails thanking Alice for her classes, praising the way she made literature relevant to him. Alice, in turn, responded politely, appreciating Jake's enthusiasm, but had no idea that her thanks were fueling something much more sinister. Jake attended Alice's classes regularly, always looking for an opportunity to get closer to her. He was one of the first to arrive and one of the last to leave. In casual conversations, Jake mentioned how literature was shaping his worldview, often returning to express his gratitude for Alice's influence on his life. She, kind and encouraging, saw this as a demonstration of passion for the subject, without realizing the deeper meaning behind the compliments and prolonged conversations. As February progressed, Jake began behaving increasingly strangely. He started showing up at extracurricular events that Alice coordinated, like the book club and after-school help hours. His constant presence began to draw the attention of Alice's colleagues, who noticed the way he seemed to always be in her shadow. On a particularly cold night, Alice was organizing a small reading event at school. Jake showed up, as usual, but this time he seemed more insistent. He looked for an opportunity to talk to Alice after the event, his behavior becoming a little more intense. During their conversation, Jake made a comment that went unnoticed by Alice, but reflected an unsettling depth. "You really understand what every word means, don't you? I just wish I could see the world through your eyes." Alice smiled, thinking it was an exaggerated compliment, and tried to change the subject. She was worried about the amount of work she still had to do, and didn't think much about it at the time. However, Jake was far from an ordinary admirer. With each interaction, his obsession with Alice grew, and he began to find ways to further infiltrate her personal life. In February 2022, Jake was developing an unhealthy fascination with Alice. He began following her social media, researching her, and collecting personal details that went beyond what was necessary for a student. Jake's obsession wasn't just about the teacher herself, but about the idea of a life he thought he could achieve if he were by her side. His thoughts and actions began to revolve around the belief that he and Alice were destined to be together, a belief that he was willing to do anything to fulfill. The atmosphere at school began to subtly change. Alice, immersed in her work and the needs of her students, did not realize the imminent danger. Jake's behavior was becoming increasingly disturbing, but she was so caught up in her routine that she failed to see the warning signs. As winter continued to grip Boston, a dark shadow was forming, and Jake's obsession was about to reach a tipping point. The town seemed silent and undisturbed, but behind this tranquil facade, a dark drama was about to unfold, changing Alice's life and those around her forever. Beacon Hill School, an institution that had been a bastion of politeness and respect, was now becoming the setting of an escalating psychological drama. Alice Harper, the dedicated literature teacher, continued to be a central figure for many students, but tension was quietly building around her. Jake Donovan, the student who had developed a disturbing obsession, was now descending into behavior that was beginning to raise more serious concerns. His obsession with Alice had evolved from simple admiration to a fixation that was beginning to destabilize his life and that of the teacher. Jake's behavior was changing drastically, and his classmates and teachers were starting to notice. In early March, Jake began showing signs that his fixation on Alice was becoming more intrusive. He began sending constant messages to Alice via school email, most of them long and emotional. Initially, the messages were compliments about the classes and thanks for Alice's attention. However, they soon became more personal and obsessive. In one message, Jake wrote, "The way you discuss the books, it's like you're talking directly to me. I wish I could be with you all the time, soaking in every word you say." These messages began to have an increasingly possessive and desperate tone. Alice, despite having read the emails, considered them an exaggerated show of gratitude from a dedicated student and did not pay much attention to them. Jake's behavior outside of school was also becoming increasingly unsettling. He started going to the same cafes and bookstores that Alice used to visit, without her noticing his presence. Jake, in an effort to get even closer, began showing up at social and cultural events that Alice attended, often unexpectedly. He seemed to always be there, watching her from a discreet distance. Alice was beginning to feel increasing discomfort. She noticed that Jake was becoming a constant visitor at her after hours and school events. He asked personal questions that she found strange, but she couldn't identify a clear reason to worry. Jake tried to appear casual, but his insistence on being close to Alice didn't go unnoticed by some classmates, who began to comment on Jake's strange behavior. The fact that Jake was starting to appear outside of the school context raised a red flag for Alice. However, she was hesitant to take drastic measures, worried about exaggerating the situation. Instead, she tried to set clearer boundaries, encouraging Jake to seek other sources of support and guidance. She directed him to school counselors, trying to redirect his obsession to a more appropriate environment. Jake, however, did not react well to Alice's attempts to set limits. Instead of backing down, he intensified his approach. He began leaving small gifts on her desk at school. Old books, notes from her classes, and even handwritten letters expressing his deep affection and admiration. These gifts were accompanied by increasingly personal messages, hoping to demonstrate their love and dedication. The situation came to a head when Jake started showing up at Alice's extracurricular events, such as her book club meetings and literary workshops. He always seemed to find a way to be present, which didn't go unnoticed by his colleagues and students. Alice began to receive advice from friends and colleagues on how to handle the situation, but was still not completely convinced that Jake posed a real threat. Meanwhile, Jake continued to delve deeper into his obsession. He started following Alice on her social networks, monitoring her posts and interactions. He studied her photos and comments, looking for clues about her personal life and interests. Jake was determined to become a significant part of Alice's life, believing that his persistence would eventually make her reciprocate his feelings. The climate at school was changing. The tension was growing as Jake became more and more visible. Jake's presence was becoming a constant source of concern for Alice, and the line between her dedication as a teacher and her need to protect her own safety was beginning to blur. She was facing a growing dilemma about how to handle the situation without causing an unnecessary uproar. Jake's obsession was now at a point where it was impossible to ignore. His behavior was no longer just strange, but a real, tangible threat. The situation was getting worse, and the atmosphere around Alice was starting to become unbearable. With winter persisting in Boston and temperatures dropping even further, the city seemed frozen in time, just as Alice's life was about to be frozen in a nightmare that was slowly unfolding. Jake's obsession was about to take a darker step, and the town was about to witness an event that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. April 15th, 2022 was one of those days when spring seemed to finally be approaching, with a shy sun and a light breeze that offered relief from the intense cold of winter. However, behind this facade of normality, a tragedy was about to occur. Boston was about to be rocked by an event as disturbing as it was silent. Alice Harper, the literature teacher, had decided to spend the night at home after a tiring day at school. With the arrival of spring, she was trying to enjoy the moments when she could relax and regain her energy. Her apartment, a modest apartment on the second floor of an old building, was warmly decorated, with books stacked on shelves and a small dining table where she used to plan her lessons. Alice had spent the afternoon preparing materials for her upcoming classes and was preparing for a quiet evening. She was in her kitchen, preparing a simple dinner, when she decided to take a break to check her mail. The pile of letters and packages on her front desk included a number of cards and packages that she had already begun to ignore. Among them, a small blue envelope caught his attention. It was one of those gifts Jake had left on his desk, a handwritten letter. Alice opened the envelope with a growing sense of uneasiness. The letter inside was yet another declaration of affection from Jake, now with an even more intense and desperate tone. The words were a mix of compliments and requests for her to see how much he loved her. The letter ended with a disturbing message. "I will do whatever it takes to be by your side, no matter what happens." As Alice tried to process the contents of the letter, a feeling of discomfort came over her. She decided to call a friend and tell her about the letter, although she still felt reluctant to alarm others without a concrete reason. Her friend suggested that Alice take precautions, but Alice didn't want to appear alarmist. That night, Alice decided to stay home and relax. She took a hot shower, put on a comfortable robe, and settled down on the couch to watch a movie. The apartment was silent except for the occasional sound of the wind hitting the windows. She had no idea that that very night, Jake Donovan was approaching her home with a sinister plan in mind. Jake, who had spent the afternoon planning and preparing for what he considered a happy ending, was now in downtown Boston, walking towards the building where Alice lived. He was dressed in dark clothing, including a coat that hid a kitchen knife he had purchased weeks earlier. Jake was nervous, but his determination to achieve what he believed was his destiny was unwavering. On the way to Alice's building, Jake stopped a few times to make sure no one was watching him. He had studied the building and knew exactly where the back entrance was, which was less visible and often not well lit. The building, with its old facade and discreet entrances, provided the perfect setting for what Jake had in mind. When Jake arrived at Alice's building, he waited patiently until the last resident had left or entered. With meticulous care, he used a tool to pry open the back door. The noise was minimal, but enough for Jake to enter undetected. Once inside, he headed toward Alice's floor, moving with a cool, calculated calm. In Alice's apartment, the atmosphere was one of quiet normality, a false sense of security that would be brutally shattered. Alice was lying on the couch, immersed in the movie, unaware that her life was about to be turned into a nightmare. Jake entered the apartment hallway silently, and when he reached the living room door, he hesitated for a moment. His footsteps were barely audible, but the tension in the air was palpable. When Jake finally entered the room, Alice got up to get a snack from the kitchen, where Jake was waiting. Upon returning to the living room, she found Jake standing there, the look of surprise and confusion on his face quickly turning into panic. Alice screamed and tried to retreat, but Jake advanced towards her with a knife in hand. The fight that followed was desperate. Alice tried to defend herself, but surprise and fear momentarily paralyzed her. Jake, driven by determination and obsession, attacked with a fury that seemed almost animalistic. He injured Alice several times before she managed to escape the knife's reach. She tried to take refuge in her kitchen, but the intensity of the attack and despair quickly weakened her. Alice, injured and bleeding, managed to reach the phone, but before she could make the call, Jake reached her again. The last part of the fight was brutal and fast. Jake, relentless in his obsession, continued the attack until Alice was unconscious on the floor. He looked at her with a mixture of triumph and despair, feeling the reality of what he had done set in. After the crime, Jake fled the apartment, leaving behind a scene of devastation and horror. The building was silent, with the only evidence of the tragedy being the blood and disorder in the living room. Jake hid in the darkness of the night, his mind a mix of ecstasy and regret. The next morning, the silence in Alice's apartment was interrupted by the sound of her worried neighbors. Fear and concern grew when they received no response to their calls. When the police arrived, the scene they found was shocking. The apartment was in disarray, and the severity of Alice's injuries was evident. The investigation began immediately, with police collecting evidence and trying to understand what had led to this brutal act. Jake Donovan was identified as the prime suspect, and his capture became a priority for authorities. The tragedy in Boston served as a grim reminder of how obsession can lead to devastating consequences. The case of Alice Harper and Jake Donovan left an indelible mark on the community. The story, marked by a sick obsession and a brutal crime, would continue to resonate in the city, raising deep questions about the nature of obsession and the fragility of personal security. The outcome of the tragedy that shook Boston began to unfold with the dawn of April 22, 2022. The city, still shaken by the brutality of the crime committed against Alice Harper, was now waiting for answers and justice. The case had captured the attention of local and national media, generating a wave of commotion and indignation. After the brutal crime, Jake Donovan was on the run. The Boston police, after identifying Jake as the prime suspect, had launched an extensive manhunt to capture him. Investigators had information about his routines and possible hiding places, but Jake had disappeared without leaving a clear trace. He had hidden, moving between areas of Boston he knew well, taking advantage of his familiarity with the city to avoid being found. Jake was acting with extreme caution, but his unstable behavior and the weight of guilt began to get to him. He took refuge in an old abandoned garage on the outskirts of Boston, a location he had used before to avoid detection. The nights were long and restless, with Jake struggling with his own thoughts and the growing sense of despair. On April 21st, a crucial turning point occurred. A local resident, who knew Jake and had noticed his unusual presence, made an anonymous report to the police. The information led investigators to an old garage where Jake was hiding. The police operation was meticulously planned, with a special tactics team preparing for what could be a dangerous situation. When the police burst into the garage, Jake was in a state of complete despair. The scene inside the garage was a dark reflection of his troubled mind. Leftover food, used clothes, and crumpled papers that showed attempts to plan his escape. Jake, surrounded and without many options, tried to resist, but was quickly subdued by the police force. The capture was made without serious incident, although Jake was in a state of visible mental agitation. Meanwhile, the crime scene at Alice Harper's apartment was meticulously investigated. The forensic team gathered evidence and analyzed every detail, from the position of objects in the apartment to the pattern of Alice's injuries. Investigators were determined to ensure that all the evidence was gathered to build a solid case against Jake. DNA tests and other forensic analyses confirmed Jake's identity as the person responsible for the crime. The messages and gifts found in Alice's house were used to chart Jake's obsession, helping to paint a more complete picture of his relationship with the victim. The severity of the injuries and the crime scene confirmed the brutality of the attack. On April 22nd, Jake Donovan was formally charged with first-degree murder, and the case began to gain significant attention in court. The hearings were marked by a series of emotional and intense moments, with the community closely watching the media coverage and awaiting justice for Alice. During the court case, the evidence presented clearly showed Jake's premeditated intent and obsession. The indictment detailed Jake's disturbing behavior, his attempts to get close to Alice, and the violent attack that resulted in her death. Witnesses and experts were called to describe the devastating impact of the crime on the community and Alice's life. In court, Jake demonstrated a behavior of complete despair and regret. He confessed to the crime, explaining that his behavior was driven by a combination of obsession and desperation. During the trial, Jake was represented by a defense attorney who tried to argue that his obsession was a mitigating factor. However, the court and the community were not willing to accept arguments that minimized the seriousness of the act committed. The verdict was handed down in late April 2022. Jake Donovan was convicted of first-degree murder, and the judge imposed the maximum sentence allowed by law. The case generated a great wave of relief and sadness, reflecting the complexity of emotions that accompanied the search for justice. The sentence was met with a mixture of relief and regret, as, despite the punishment, the loss of Alice and the trauma caused could not be repaired. The impact of the crime was not limited to the school community and Alice's family. The case provoked wider reflection on personal security, obsession, and the need for psychological support for those facing emotional difficulties. The tragedy highlighted the importance of being aware of warning signs and the need for more effective support for those who may be at risk of acting violently. Alice Harper was remembered as a dedicated teacher and loved by her colleagues and students. His memory was honored through tributes and ceremonies that celebrated his life and legacy. Jake Donovan's case, although it ended in court, left a deep and lasting mark on the city of Boston, serving as a grim reminder of the consequences of obsession and the importance of constant vigilance to prevent such tragedies.